Good evening, Mr. President, and I'm extremely delighted to see you at the podium, and I could get used to that. I want to start by saying on this bill that I was very pleased to be able to vote during the July special session for the bill that made COVID-19 an acceptable reason to ask for and receive an absentee ballot application and to vote in a way that makes people feel safe. I think that was a positive that this legislature enacted in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. I do feel that the process since then has not been as good. I would have liked to see something completely different. The absentee ballot process has existed in our state for many, many years and has worked well. And I think that it would have been far better for the existing process to have been continued. Basically, what I'm saying is that normally a person who is not able to vote in person on Election Day is able to contact their local town government and make a request, or through the Secretary of State, and ask for an absentee ballot application to be completed and to vote absentee. And that law remains in effect. I would have preferred to see the Secretary of State use resources provided by the federal government for the purpose of informing the public so that they would have the ability to make that decision for themselves. But instead, what we got was a very different process, a process by which the Secretary of State took it upon herself, of course with the executive authority of the governor of our state, to do a mass mailing to every person on the voter rolls in our state instead, so that they would all receive absentee ballot applications. The first thing is that is an extremely expensive thing to do. Imagine what it costs to mail a single letter, and now you're talking about sending absentee ballot applications to well over 1 million people, and then also having to process the ballot applications and send ballots when they respond. That expense is something that's completely unnecessary when a great many of those people would still choose to vote in person, and in fact they still will this November election. The other concern, and I pointed this out in July when we were here discussing the previous bill, in this very chamber I went through a laundry list of emails, letters, and correspondence I received from my own constituents, just a small segment of the population of our state, indicating, showing, and showcasing all of the many different ways this process has caused confusion. There are voters in our state who don't know the difference between receiving the absentee ballot application versus the ballot. They don't know that they can vote in person in some cases. So we're answering a lot of questions about, well, I did get this form. Do I have to fill this out in order to vote? So they're confusing this in a lot of ways with whether it's a registration or an actual vote. That's one problem. But the larger problem is the number of people that are receiving these documents that are incorrect. I have constituents who have received multiple ballot applications to their address that don't reflect the occupants of that address at all. You have children that have moved away to another state. You have previous residents that have lived at a particular address. You have folks that got married, and now they're receiving a ballot application form in both their married name and their maiden name. This is a lot of extra expense, as I mentioned, and a lot of extra confusion. And now we are faced with a new problem, which is that because so many people are going to vote by absentee ballot in this election, which I think would not necessarily have happened without the mass mailing. Again, I will stop just for a second to make it abundantly clear to anyone watching this. I am in favor of letting people vote by absentee because of COVID-19. I am not in favor of sending a ballot application unsolicited to every person in this state, living or dead, to the dog, to the neighbor, to the previous occupant, or the multitude of other things that have happened along the way. The bill that's before us essentially is a Band-Aid to that problem. I'm told that the reason why this bill is before us is essentially because it's going to fix Election Day. Well, the only reason, ladies and gentlemen, why we have to fix Election Day is because Election Day is going to be a problem. And Election Day is going to be a problem because of the mass mailing of absentee ballot applications, which is overwhelming our town clerks and registrars across this state. It's a grave concern to me because if America stands for any single thing, it is that we have a genuine Democratic Republican government. That's what type of government we have. We have a representative form of government that requires that we have elections that are beyond reproach, that elections have to matter, and people have to trust the results of those elections. And I'm here to tell you that there are people that will not trust these elections. They are going to be concerned that these elections did not happen the way they were supposed to, that ballots were not counted. I forgot to mention when I was listing the problems with the mass mailing that there are a great many people who will not receive a ballot application even though they are eligible voters also. So you have a problem with people receiving too many ballot applications and people not receiving them at all. That is no way to ensure the integrity of our election process in our state. It would have been so much more simple to inform the public that they have the right to ask for an absentee ballot. This would have limited the number of them to only the people that had sincerely wanted to vote in that manner, and we would have done a service to our community by educating people on the different ways to be part of our democracy. I do have a couple of questions about the bill, Mr. President, so let me just ask them before I move on. I guess that the first section of the bill establishes an election monitor. And just looking at this, it says it applies only to cities that have a population over 140,000. And we all know from experience in this chamber that that means that it's going to apply to only one city, and that's Bridgeport. And I certainly don't object to having an election monitor in Bridgeport, but I'm just curious, Mr. President, through you to the proponent of the bill, if there's a reason why we chose only Bridgeport to have an election monitor.
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Senator Haskell.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and it's great to see you up there. I thank my friend Senator Sampson for his question. My understanding, Senator, is that this was at the request of the Bridgeport delegation, both in the House and the Senate. I'm not aware of any other delegation that has requested an election monitor for the upcoming election. Thank you. Through you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Haskell. Senator Sampson.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and I thank the gentleman for his answer. Again, I think that having an election monitor makes a lot of sense based on our experience with elections in the major cities. Certainly, Bridgeport is a place where it seems to me almost every November Wednesday morning after Election Day, there seems to be a news story about something that happened in one of our major cities, including Bridgeport, as far as elections. And this goes back to my earlier point, which is we want to make sure that we ensure the integrity of our elections in every way possible. I noticed that the election monitor will be contracted through December 31st of this year. And I'm just curious to know why that is, through you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Senator Haskell.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. My understanding is that the election monitor will serve in their capacity until December 31st, 2020. This will be paid for, of course, as my good colleague and friend, Senator Flexer, mentioned, through the COVID relief funds that the federal government provided to Connecticut under the CARES Act. And I believe the reason that we're seeing it sometime after Election Day would relate to any recanvassing or later inspection of the absentee ballot process and procedure. Thank you, Mr. President, through you.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you for that answer. That makes perfect sense. I just wanted to have it on the record, the reason why we are carrying that contract so far beyond Election Day. It's so people understand that, in fact, there could be a recount or other things that might require the services of that election monitor. I listened to the House debate on this bill yesterday, and I think that they did a very good job of going through section by section and discussing what each thing does. And to be honest with the people in the room and anyone listening, I don't have any significant objections to what is before us in the language, but there are some questions that I think might cause someone who is not completely informed with the election process to scratch their head and wonder why we're allowing certain things or why certain language is in the bill. And one of the big things is this question about the outer envelope versus the inner envelope of an absentee ballot. So when a voter requests a ballot via their ballot application, they are mailed the document, which they would complete, their ballot, sign it, and then it goes inside of an outer envelope. And that gets sent off to be part of the election. And when it is received, that is, in our laws, kept sealed up until Election Day under normal circumstances. This bill allows the outer envelope to be removed prior to that. The language in the bill, I think, allows for 7 days ahead of time. And my understanding is that the purpose of that is simply to allow one step to be processed ahead of Election Day, hopefully to save some time, and that is to allow the folks that are going to be tallying the ballots to put them in their respective polling locations so that they can be properly sorted to be tallied later. And I would just like to confirm for legislative intent and for the record that there is nothing that would allow someone to be able to identify how a person voted by virtue of opening just the outer ballot. Is that correct through you, Mr. President?
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Senator Haskell.
Thank you, Mr. President. Through you, yes, that is correct. Through existing law, nothing is altered in this statute as to the content of the inner versus the outer envelope. Absentee ballots consist of an outer envelope that contains the elector's name and address, and an inner envelope which contains the elector's marked ballot and a statement signed by the elector under penalty of false statement. Just for the purpose of clarity, I think it's important we be abundantly clear. This allows for 4 days if municipalities decide to opt in. So starting 5 p.m. Friday, 4 days before the election, this year it would be Friday, October 30th, they can begin the process of separating the outer envelope from the inner envelope, rejecting ballots, rejecting inner envelopes that are not signed, but not counting those ballots themselves. Thank you, Mr. President, through you.
Thank you, Senator Haskell. Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you for that clarification. Forgive me, there are quite a few dates in this legislation before us, and it's easy to get confused by which one is which, and that is correct. Friday at 5 p.m. is the deadline for the outer envelopes. I'll make a note also that when the good chairman of the GAE committee was speaking earlier, she had mentioned that there would be no counting of the ballots, and I know that she meant there'd be no tallying of the votes. But there will indeed be counting of the ballots. They'll be counting the number of ballots that are actually submitted. And I think she, in fact, mentioned that we've received over 400,000 thus far. So there is certainly a count taken of how many people are voting by absentee, but that is not the same thing as determining how many people have actually voted or how they have voted. All things that are obviously very important to maintain the integrity of the election. I also want to clarify that this bill is vastly improved over previous versions that I have seen because it is not, in fact, a mandate. It is permissive and allows the various municipalities to use these new procedures where they see it might be necessary. And again, my position on this language before us is that these things may, in fact, be helpful under the circumstances to allow these town clerks to be able to manage this election and the mountains of absentee ballots that they will ultimately receive. There is one aspect of the bill language that I'm a little uncomfortable with, and I would like to just clarify for the record what the change is to the time frame for someone to withdraw an absentee ballot, presuming that they would be in town. The current law, I believe, allows them to do that up until the Monday before Election Day. And I'd like to know what the change is. Through you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Senator Haskell.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank the good senator for his question. I've spoken with many town clerks about this legislation that's before us today, and while it is only permissive and does not include a mandate, for the purpose of clarity across the state, it does, whether a municipality decides to opt in to those pre-processing procedures or decides to maintain their current procedures, it does make sure that absentee ballots cannot be withdrawn any later than 5 p.m. on Friday. The reason is, for those municipalities that do opt into the pre-processing procedure, it will become logistically difficult, if not impossible, to determine which ballots belong to whom after they've begun to separate the inner envelope from the outer envelope. The reason that it's a statewide decision at this point is because it will become incredibly complex for voters to try to figure out which towns are actually participating in the pre-processing procedure, which is contemplated in this bill, as opposed to which towns have decided not to. And as a result, a statewide policy that absentee ballots can't be withdrawn any later than Friday at 5 p.m. This election, of course, that's Friday, October 30th, 4 days before the election, is that's the reform contained in this bill. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Haskell. Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I appreciate that answer and that clarification. It is a minor concern of mine that we are changing what has been a long-standing provision in our laws that I think some people who have voted absentee, several times in the past may be aware of. And I'm not sure exactly how we are going to publicize this change in a way that, our constituents are going to be aware of it. I also have a little bit of an issue with us being here a month before Election Day, changing the election laws for which each of us are likely on the ballot. I think there's something that's dangerous about that, and I do have a concern from that perspective. I have one final question, and that is simply a question of, I guess I would say to create confidence for people. I would like to ask the good Vice Chair of the GAA Committee if he can explain for us why folks should be confident in this process, given that town clerks are going to receive ballot applications and ballots far more than they've ever seen. They may not have the staff to do so. And what exactly happens when someone shows up on Election Day and they have voted before? Does the process that has always protected that situation before, where they're marked off on a list that they have voted by absentee, still stand? I guess I'm looking just for the proponents' vision for why this is the most effective policy we can put forward. Through you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Senator Haskell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Senator, for your question. Look, I don't think it's ideal for any of us to be here so close to the election at a time when the legislature isn't normally convened and where we're taking up a pretty narrow agenda. But under the leadership of Senator Flexer and, of course, Representative Fox, we're taking up this bill because it is so critically important to do exactly what I believe you're talking about today, Senator, and that's making sure that voters have confidence in the integrity and the accessibility of our elections. So for anyone who is at home and perhaps listening to this special session, recognize that, one, you can go onto the Secretary of State's website to confirm that your absentee ballot was received by the town clerk. That is a surefire way to make sure that your vote is counted. Another critical thing, every day, Senator, every day I hear from my constituents anxiety about the sanctity of our democracy, anxiety about the U.S. Postal Service not being able to handle the influx of absentee ballots. That's why this legislature, I think so critically, approved the installation of absentee ballot drop boxes, which can be used both for the deposit of absentee ballots, but also absentee ballot applications in Connecticut at every town hall, and in some municipalities, multiple drop boxes across the state. But I think we're here today largely because our constituents are wringing their hands about the upcoming historic election, what we anticipate to be record-setting participation, and the fact that we're processing this election in a moment of a global pandemic, both here in Connecticut and across the country. We can't control what happens in Florida or Ohio or Iowa or Michigan, but we can in this chamber control what happens in Connecticut and give each of our constituents, whether they vote for us or not, the peace of mind that their vote will be counted and that it will be done so safely and pertinent to this bill, that it will be done so promptly and that they will not have to wait days for an election result. I hope that answers your question. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Haskell. Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I appreciate the answer very much. And I respect the desire of the majority to try and reassure people in our state that this election is going to be held to the highest standards possible. However, I stand by my position that the mass mailing of absentee ballots has created almost an impossible set of circumstances for that to happen. And I know I said I wasn't going to ask any more questions, but I do have one or two more follow-ups based on the recent conversation. One of them is, when, through you, Mr. President, do we expect to get results for cities and towns across Connecticut for the November 3rd election? Normally, we find out at some point on the evening of that Tuesday in November. Is that going to be the case here, or are we going to have to wait until long after before we have legitimate results? Through you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Senator Haskell.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator, for your question. I wouldn't presume to speak for the municipal clerks and registrars who will be doing this work on the ground, and I imagine that it will vary, the answer to your question will vary widely between Connecticut's 169 municipalities, and it will be, of course, impacted by the level of turnout that we see. That said, it is abundantly clear from political scientists to those who are working on both Republican and Democratic campaigns that we are not going to know nationwide the results of the presidential election on election night, as this country is so accustomed to. What we're doing today is making sure that rather than throwing up our hands, at least in this state, we're rolling up our sleeves to make sure that results will be a little bit more prompt. We believe that the steps that we took in July to make sure that absentee ballots can begin to be counted at 6 a.m. on Election Day will give town clerks and registrars and the staff that they employ temporarily for Election Day 14 more critical hours to process those ballots, speeding up the process a little bit. But this permissive language allows municipalities that are seeing an influx in absentee ballots to go one step further, to make sure that they can also begin to process those ballots, separate inner and outer envelopes, reject ballots that haven't been signed, sort them into piles according to their voting district, things that will just make the process run a little bit more smoothly. I certainly don't have a crystal ball, and while I would love to have results on election night, I don't know if we'll be so lucky, but we will at least not be waiting quite as long as those states that are not being as proactive as Connecticut is by taking up this legislation. Thanks, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Haskell. Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you very much to the distinguished Vice Chairman. I appreciate the answer very much and your effort to give me as complete an answer as possible. But at the end of the day, it sounds like I don't know is really the answer. And I'm not trying to say that as an inadequate response, because I don't think any of us do. But I think that is a concern. I think that in our republic, people are used to getting a relatively quick response to elections. I mean, it is 2020 after all. And we have the ability to do a great many things using the technology of the day. And it seems that this process is almost archaic. And looking at it, and the results might take a substantial amount of time. And that opens a lot of concerns, not just the delay in having results, but when that delay occurs, then you have other questions about the integrity of the election, which I'm somewhat fearful of. I'm going to close just by saying that, I've been thinking back and forth about how I was going to vote on this bill. The language that's before us is reasonable in that it really is trying to accommodate a set of what I said were impossible circumstances. We have put our local staff that is going to be responsible for tallying the ballots for this election cycle in a very, very difficult position. And that position is difficult enough as it is. And I will take a moment to thank the people that offer their time and energy to be part of our election day process, because it's a long and grueling day. And this process is going to make it even much more long and grueling. It also begs the more important question about whether or not it is actually safe to vote on election day. And I believe that in all of the polling locations that I have been to, I visited a number of them on primary day. In every case, it seemed that they were following every possible protocol to maintain safe elections. There was safe distancing. People were certainly wearing masks, and the polling stations were widely, dispersed to accommodate folks, and they certainly did a good job of managing the foot traffic. So I believe it's completely safe to vote in person, and I'm tempted to have a conversation about whether or not it's safe for us to be in this chamber, but I missed my chance because we didn't get to vote on the rule or speak on the rules the other day. And this session day has been a bit of a struggle for me because I have a lot of things I would like to say about this process and this session. And I know I've got to stay on target, which is the bill before us. So I will close and say that, again, this bill is before us for one reason, and that is because we need to come up with Band-Aids to fix a major problem. And the major problem is what I consider to be a criminal act, which was the mass mailing of absentee ballot applications to this state's residents in an unsolicited fashion with very little concern or effort to correct the voter rolls beforehand. The number of problems that are going to occur are numerous, and this supposed fix to that problem is not going to be a fix at all. I don't believe that election day is going to run smoothly, and people will walk away in our state concerned about whether the election was legitimate. And that is an unbelievable shame. And I am beside myself about it. And because of that, I just can't support the bill that's before us because it is just a further enabling of a terrible, terrible process that should not have ever happened to begin with. And with that, I thank the chamber for its time, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Will you mark further? Senator Haskell.
Thank you, Mr.